Hi, this is Karl-James. I've decided to look at the areas of teaching that I've been doing this week with my archaeology classes, and I've decided that I would do this more vocally and visually with what I've got to say without images, because it's a subject that you really can't illustrate. It's the final class in the series, the Archaeology of Landscape, and I decided to do tradition. And the first time I presented this was on the 29th of September 2016 to my Skype students, and then I delivered it on Thursday to two of my classes, one in Landscape Archaeology and one in Bridgend, which I turn up in person and present. Now, the archaeology of tradition is really to be seen looking at folk traditions, looking at myths and legends, and I've thrown a few into this, but I really couldn't do them all. And one unusual one in this is toad in the hole. That's a bit of a tradition, which we'll quickly look at. The Marry Lloyd, which is a Welsh tradition that I do believe was a British tradition, an English tradition as well. The maypole, which is seen in England more than anything today, but was a Welsh tradition as well. Let's actually move on from that Welsh and English before we even start. I'm one of those believers that when you think about Wales and England, and you think about traditions, myths and legends, lots of if you want to divide, use that border. So you've got Wales here and England there. Wales before 1282 and England before 1282 had very similar religion, very similar traditions and folk traditions and myths and legends. King Arthur's across the board. The likes of the maypole we know is across the board. For example, the first time the maypole was recorded was actually in Wales. But now we know traditionally it's an English tradition. Anyway, moving on. Up until 1282, Wales had its sense of independence. It was principality. But after 1282, between 1282 and 1284, Llywelyn the Last and David was defeated by Edward I, and Wales ceased to exist. So then when you should be referring to Wales, even today, you should be referring to Wales as England. You know, I'm born in Wales, but I'm born in Wales as part of England. I'm English. Like everybody else in this land of Wales is actually English. Whether they're born in Carnarvon or Barry, they're still English. And that's the point I want to make, that those traditions, those English traditions, are also Welsh traditions, but there's one other problem. In 1349, Wales was hit by the great disaster, the great turmoil, the death, the real death, the plague, the bubonic plague, the pneumonic plague, and the septicemic plague hit Wales all at the same time in 1349. 1348, bubonic plague hit England, and then by the winter you've got pneumonic plague, and then septicemic plague the next year in 1349. By the time it's hitting Wales, all three of them are hitting Wales, and you can assume that the population of Wales was probably in about 1315. The population of Wales was roughly about 200,000, right? Wales was flourishing. By 1352, after the three plagues has done its worst, and anthrax and other horrible illnesses had done their worst in Wales, people were malnourished by that stage anyway, so they had no resistance. Even like rabies, everything was hitting Wales at the same time. And the point being is that the population after 1352, 1353 in Wales was probably reduced by 80 to 90%. So that you can assume that the population of Wales was somewhere between 30 and 20,000 any of those traditions, like the maypole, anything like the Lloyd, which sort of did continue up until the turn of the 1900s, and it was revived very recently. All the traditions were wiped out. Nobody cared about traditions, folklore, legends, myths, and all the rest of it. Just went out the window. All that stuff was lost, but continued in England because the Great Plague, I call it the Great Plague. The Great Plague is the one in 1665. But when you think about it, this was the first Great Plague in 1348, 1349, and this plague itself didn't do the worst it could have in England. Okay, people had some tolerance and resistance by the time the Septicemic come around, and they were very wary of the plague. In Wales, were hit by it in one batch. So all those traditions and everything went out the window. So when we look at traditions today, we look at Robin Hood, could be a bit of a Welsh tradition as well. King Arthur, bit of a Welsh tradition. Don't want to go there. Even like the Wayland the Smithy, which is a Nordic sort of story, Scandinavian sagas, and even like the maypole, we could do loads of them. Okay, we could do elves and goblins and dwarves and all of this rest of it, but we just don't have time to do that. I've already used up 6 minutes. So anyway, let's just do this. So let's just have a bit of an overview. And actually, this is the archaeology of landscape traditions. Where's the archaeology in it? We're going to come into that in a short while. Now, one thing about these folklore traditions, if you want to take Wales as part of England now, okay, and look at the traditions that way, and if people want to comment on my video log and say, my God, you're betraying your Welsh roots, I'm not, I'm an archaeologist, I look for fact, okay, that's what I do. So anyway, folklores, okay, forget England and Wales now, folklores. Across the board, okay? The black dog. The black dog is essentially a nocturnal apparition, okay? Malevolent, horrible, the portent of death. Whenever you saw the black dog in front of you, it would probably pounce on you and kill you. Think of the Hound of the Baskervilles. Think about Baskerville Hall. Think about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Where did he get that idea about the dog from? Yes. Is some based on folklore and fact there. Could black dogs actually exist? It's across European folklore. This dog that lives in a lair somewhere. Well, actually, we've got some archaeological evidence, but we'll come on to that. People like in the sagas of Harry Potter, okay, you've got the likes of the boggart mentioned, but the boggart is like one of those horrible household spirits that are there that people really believe in, and whenever you move, the boggart would come with you. You see that in Harry Potter, okay. J.K. Rowling used it really well. She used lots of these folklores really well as well. So think about something like the corn dolly. Now the corn dolly is a really interesting one. Now the corn dolly is a tradition that's continued on, okay. The idea is that when you harvest your corn in, say, September back then, in the medieval period, because harvests were sort of a little bit later because of whatever, change the environment and so on. Corn dollies represent the spirit of the corn. So when you've harvested all the corn is effectively homeless. It's not fixed to the land. So what you do, you just get some of that corn, you create a dolly, put it in your home, and it represents that the corn now has a home. Except you're eating most of it. Dragons, folklore, traditions. Where does the dragon come from? That's a really complicated one. This idea about dragons is really rich in English consciousness, and it's really rich there. It's across. If you want to look at Somerset, if you want to look at Wiltshire, Uffington Horse, where you've got the dragon map there, you've got over the border then, you know what I'm talking about, okay, what we call Wales today, over the border, you got the idea of a dragon in the northeast and all the rest of it. When you think about dwarves, the next thing, dwarves and goblins and hobgoblins and all the rest of it, think maybe that there are lots of people around today. My partner's only 5 foot tall, but there are people around that I know are 4 foot tall, and there are people around who are no more than 2 foot tall. You could understand them as being dwarvish. Okay, in the stories of the likes of J.R.R. Tolkien, he discusses dwarves, he discusses orcs and goblins, which were in fact a distortion of what Sauron was doing. When you look at J.R.R. Tolkien, because he's gone deep into this. In other words, what we're saying is that all figures, except say the Ent and a few other figures in the books of J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Silmarillion, and so on. We're looking at the distortion of human beings. Oh, terrible thing for me to say that a small person is a distortion of a human being. It's a slight different human being, we should say, but in the ideas of Sauron and Silmarillion, it is that distortion that we're looking at. So yeah, those things exist. Corn dollies exist, they're real, tradition, whatever. The Green Man, that's an interesting one. The Green Man, a sculpture drawing, other representation of a face surrounded by or made with leaves. You see that representation. Lots of people, even way back in Paleolithic times, okay, and you can look at Wayland the Smith here, hence given its name to Wayland Smithy, which is also near Uffington, just south of Uffington. You've got the idea of this smithy living in the woods, Wayland living in the woods, and he's somewhat of a malevolent spirit, and he's a smithy. But the Green Man is something very similar, somebody living in this great green wood. And the idea of living in that great green wood, it has to be represented by somebody who cares for it. J.R.R. Tolkien there, the Ent there, but the Green Man itself is very different. Person in green, green leaves, somebody living in the woods, actually a tree itself. Okay, people were afraid of woodlands and so on. Even people are still afraid of woodlands today. You know, a dark wood, you're afraid of it. Maybe somebody's living in the Green Man. Green Man is benevolent rather than malevolent. Okay, Wayland is more of a malevolent spirit. When you look at in this list, there's loads of things in this list. For example, when you look at the maypole, this is a really interesting one. The idea of the maypole is primarily in areas, even in Scotland. Okay, my notes tell me, and I don't agree with this. My notes tell me that the maypole was introduced by the Normans into Wales. Let's get rid of that faff, okay? Go back to what I said at the beginning. I think the maypole is sort of a British thing, okay? It's a tradition all over. Not brought over by bloody, mind my French, not brought over by the Normans, right? It was a British tradition, right? It's first recorded in a Welsh poem by Gruffydd Eidath ap Dafydd in the 1300s, where he describes a tall birch pole, a place called Llanidloes in Wales, was the place that the maypole was being practiced. But we know that the maypole is traditionally an Anglo tradition, okay? Using my words tenderly. It's seen over the border more in England than it is in Scotland and Wales now, but that's because it's survived all back to that idea of the plague all the way back. It's a custom that is really, really well established by the 1400s, even after the diaspora of the plague. And it really keeps going until the mid-1600s, where actually the Protestants start to say, let's not do the maypole. Okay, it even goes back to King Edward. Okay, King Edward VI. That it's declared that maybe King Edward VI. You're talking about the 1550s, early 1550s, Edward VI, he outlaws the maypole and they're destroyed, but they do continue into about the 1650s when the Puritans start to get their own way and start to burn them all down and chop them all down. That's the maypole. Oh, a few more traditions before we look at the bit of the archaeological evidence, okay? Look about this one, the idea of Robin Hood, we'll do that in a while. Well dressing, the idea of well dressing, dressing, putting rags at wells, putting symbolism at wells, putting pins down wells, that's all tradition that's continued. Loads of other things we could talk about, the red caps, little people around burial chambers and all the rest of it. Let's go with this nice one, okay? Now, not so long ago, actually months ago, I came up with a story from the internet. It's from this one. It's known as the skeleton of the legendary devil dog Black Shuck, who terrorized East Anglia. Is it actually real? Folklore says a 7-foot hellhound. Okay, they actually archaeologists excavating at Leiston Abbey in Suffolk, as this follows. Said up until this point, this Shuck, this hellhound, this devil dog, this black dog with red failing eyes. It roamed the countryside, spreading death and terror, a giant ferocious hellhound with flaming eyes and savage claws. For centuries the beast that came to be known as Black Shuck struck fear into the heart of all that crossed it. Just a single glimpse was enough to impart a fatal curse, the briefest encounter sufficient to suck the life from any helpless victim. Yeah, you're getting attacked by a bloody 7-foot dog, basically not long, but when it was on its hind, 7 foot. Okay, it's said that it's been argued whether black shucks did exist, okay, whether it was just a bloody silly myth out there to scare people, but it's believed that the black shuck did in fact exist. It was discovered a few miles from 2 churches where black shuck is said to have killed worshippers during an almighty storm in August 1577. Now, they describe exactly what the archaeologists have found, a 7-foot long skeleton, okay, in East Anglia. And the idea of the black shuck is all aboard, okay, in that area, Suffolk, East Anglia and so on, okay, Norfolk way, that area. Now, they're looking at this, okay? The first legend is this. The beast's most celebrated attack began at Holy Trinity Church at Blythburgh. A clap of thunder burst open the church doors and a hairy black devil dog came snarling in. It ran through the congregation, killing a man and a boy and causing the church steeple to fall through the roof. Okay, that was to do with the storm, okay? The dog, this is me now, the dog itself was probably in one of those rants. It hadn't eaten. Maybe somebody had starved it to deliberately do this and release it on the storm in the night. But let's go back to this text, okay? Scorch marks, scratch marks, still visible on a church door are purported to have come from Shuck's claws as it fled. Maybe in the archaeological evidence we can look at the dog's claws, match it up with the scratch marks on the door, and maybe work out this is a real dog that slew these individuals. All down the church in the midst of fire the hellish monster flew and passed onwards to the choir he many people slew. Oh, brilliant! 12 miles away in Bungay, where 2 worshippers were killed at St. Mary's Church, one left shriveled like a drawn purse as he prayed. So we've got up to 4 people killed. Okay, the excavations by Dig Ventures recognize that this dog itself may actually date from around 1577. 1577, just reiteration, yeah, from Abraham Fleming. A strange and terrible wonder. Satan-like beast came running all along down the body of the church with great swiftness and incredible haste among the people in a visible form and shape, wringing the necks of 2 parishioners as they knelt. Now, I think this is amazing that we've possibly found archaeological evidence for a folk tradition, and the dog itself was seemingly buried in an unmarked grave 20 inches deep. I believe, and this is me, that this is going back to that bit like the Hound of the Baskervilles thing. This is a 14-ton dog. Bloody hell. 14-stone dog and stood 7 foot tall on its hind legs. I believe this. The archaeologists found this body of this dog that may or may not have been responsible for these 2 murders. Well, 2 can a dog murder someone? Well, these 2 sets of killings at these 2 churches, near Leiston Abbey in Suffolk. And I believe that maybe the dog had been starved by its owner. There was a thunderstorm. The owner deliberately let the dog loose. The dog entering the church. A thunderstorm. It happened to be a coincidence that there was a strike of lightning hitting the tower. Dog does its worst, and then the dog goes to another church, does its worst. The owner then kills the dog, deliberately buries it in Leiston Abbey. Job done. That's me, the archaeologist, explaining something very logical. 4th of August, but this legend and tradition is very, very real if you look at the archaeology. Now, as we start to go on, we can't do this whole thing about tradition. We mentioned Wayland, the smithy. We haven't really gone into the Mary Lloyd. Now, the Mary Lloyd itself is a tradition in Wales up until Mary Trevilian's writings at the end of the 1800s, 1900s. What we really see is the Mary Lloyd, which is basically is the grey horse. The horse itself is a representation of an ancient tradition which actually came back not so long ago in the village of Cowbridge, and I do believe it's been reinvigorated in the village of Landscape Major in the Vale of Glamorgan, South Wales. And the whole point of the Mary Lloyd is to, I believe, from what I've read and researched, to leave the old year behind. Right, so the Mary Lloyd is a representation of a horse's skull in a white or black gown, followed by his entourage with blackened faces and black gowns. They knock somebody's door. And the whole point of this is that this takes place just after Christmas, around that period when you're into the New Year period, you're into extra light. The idea of the Mary Lloyd is to knock somebody's door. They allow you entry, and the Mary Lloyd is a bit mischievous, but the other individuals are then offered the previous year's alcohol, some butter, some bread. It's and they basically eat the old stuff, okay, before the new stuff is restocked in the pantry. And if you do not allow the Mary Lloyd into your house, it does all sorts of mischief, bent and debauchery, and you should, in other words, allow it into your house. This is a tradition that may actually be a very much Anglicised, Welshicized, actually Britishised tradition across the board. Right, the next one. I want to mention this one. What we're going to do, I just haven't mentioned about the maypole as well. The maypole, we do actually have archaeological evidence in villages across the land of holes in the village green filled with charred timber, and you can get an idea from the aperture, the diameter of this hole in the ground and the depth, how tall the pole was, okay, even an idea of what timber was being used, archaeological evidence. This is a nice one, a bit of a tradition, not so much about human beings, but on about the toad and frogs. It was well described in works in about the 1800s and before, about the idea of the toad in the hole, and it's seen across Europe, varying different examples across Europe. It was something very much of a curiosity. Basically, what people would find in quarries as they were working, they would break open a stone and a toad would crawl out, right? And this would happen across Europe and Britain. There's over 200 examples being recorded from the 1800s and last references in about 1980s. But the problem is no geologist or expert has ever seen this phenomenon. Some believe it's easily explained, that you would break open a stone, but there was a toad or a frog lying underneath it, and you'd break open a stone, a toad or a frog would jump out. Okay, it could be explained quite logically like that. It could be explained by this way, my logical way, where in archaeology, in geology as well, we find nodules in the ground. Quartz nodules, and actually hollow. If you see one of those at the bottom of a riverbed, a little toad or a frog might actually crawl into it when it's really junior. And basically, when it grows, it's eaten away its little sort of bugs and stuff as it crawls into the stone. But it gets too big, it can't get out. Somebody break opens a nodule, toad crawls out, job done. That explains it. One quick thing, Reverend Buckland himself, the great Reverend Buckland, the antiquarian who excavated the Lady of the Pavland, who was informed about it in 1822 and excavated there in 1823. The Reverend Buckland himself is one of these individuals who wanted to examine this phenomenon. But this is also the same guy who brought a mammoth skull back to his office in Oxford, puts it on his desk. Next day turns out the mammoth skull's disappeared. He loses it in his office. So, you know, bit of lack of credibility. But he did excavate the Lady of Pavland down on the Gower, a body dating back to about 28,000 years ago, as it's now been radiocarbon dated and so on. Isn't in fact a red lady, is in fact a bloke. But anyway, looking at this, he buried a load of toads in his garden in sort of limestone and sandstone nodules, okay, to see if they survived. After a year or so, his wife was complaining about the stink in the garden. He excavated most of these nodules, and most of the toads and frog, I think it was just mainly toads actually, they were found decaying in these nodules, that most of them had died, but the ones that had survived were probably kept alive by some moisture going through the rock. However, Moving on. He decided that the surviving toads he would rebury in his garden. They all died after a year, and therefore he said, look, there's no such thing that toads and frogs could ever survive or live in these nodules in the ground. So that tradition about toads in the holes have been discounted, but other people, I think it's a Jeremy Clark in his books and explained. He believed, for example, that the idea of the toad in a hole phenomenon can't really be categorically concluded. Right, two other things quickly. So looking at the legend, the folk tradition of the likes of Robin Hood. Now, everyone likes a hero, everyone likes a bad guy, everyone likes somebody putting his fingers up to authority. There you go. The idea of Robin Hood may actually be described across a figure, Hereward the Wake, who objected to the Normans coming into this country and fought against the Normans. Maybe that's a Robin Hood-like figure. Robin Hood may have been a real figure in the reign of King Richard. When Richard was away, he was objecting to what King John was done, the usual thing. And what simply happened when Richard came back, 1199 or whatever, he pardoned Robin of Locksley. Apparently, Robert of Locksley. Robert had his lands back, and then Richard died, John took over. Locksley had all his land taken back over by John. The memory of Locksley was completely extinguished and destroyed. Robin started fighting a resistance fight in the woods against the sheriff in Nottingham and King John, blah blah blah, and all the real information was erased. Actually, we don't know anything about Robin Hood. Really, it's all out there. It's a bit like King Arthur as well. Robin the Hood, Robin the Hood seller, Robin the murderer, Robin with Little John in the woods. Everyone liked this folk hero who would raid the king's wagons and would assault Nottingham and Nottingham's men in the woods and so on. What's all this about? But it's a lovely legend. Talking about legends quickly is the legend of King Arthur. Now, King Arthur is something that archaeologists don't go and it really explain much about, because it's a very dodgy subject altogether. I've known great archaeologists, the archaeologist Eric J. Talbot. I don't even know if who's still alive. He excavated at the site of Peterston Super Montum, and now I cannot comment on that. But the excavations led to his demise as an archaeologist. His credibility was lost, and the goblet, the chalice of King Arthur is something that most of us archaeologists don't touch. It's ruined. The archaeologists who have excavated at Tintagel a decade or so ago, lots of them looking at Avalon, Somerset, it's ruined people's careers. But as an archaeologist myself, a presenter and an actor, but that's something else. As an archaeologist on my professional level, I would say that when you look at King Arthur, maybe the evidence has been lost. I believe that King Arthur was one of many people. It was a popular name after Roman civilization and what was left of it collapsed in 476 in the Western Roman world. There may have been a leader who was of Roman stock. He would have been of Roman stock resisting any of the invaders, right? But there may have been more than one of him. There would have been lots of leaders resisting the invaders coming over. Well, people just sort of dispirited with what was going on. We don't necessarily need invaders to come over. It's disunity and there's internal fighting, which we see about all the later stories about King Arthur and talking about Gildas and Nennius and whatever. But forget all that. I think King Arthur was a popular name of a leadership figure, maybe a general, whatever. There may have been a King Arthur in Tintagel that was completely separate from a King Arthur, say in Somerset, from a King Arthur up north, from a King Arthur in Wales. There may have also been a King Arthur in Camel and Dunham, which was Colchester. It was probably the name given to a popular resistance figure who were in all these different areas. And that's as far as we can really go. The recent excavation work at Tintagel tells us something very interesting, though. And also from the excavations at Alcock, at Dinas Powys in the 1950s. where what we do, we actually see extensive trade links going into the late 400s, 500s from leadership figures in these areas, and they kept the links with Europe going. There must have been great trade and much great wealth going forward, so it wasn't the extinguishing of Roman civilization after 476. So there's a bit about King Arthur. Hopefully you've enjoyed these traditions. Now, those who are watching this in real time, this is actually real time. This is actually from the week. I've got lots to catch up on. One thing is the next series of lectures. If anyone wants to sign up for my Skype class, they have to contact me, leave a message. Now, Skype classes every Tuesday. I do this live for 2 hours. We're doing the archaeology of artifacts. If anyone wants to join it, leave a message. Skype class is £5. You can see it. If you type in www.archeologycompany.ghosts.weeby.com, you can sign up. You can pay. It's £5 a week, and then if you leave your email address, I'll add you into the Skype class, and you can take part this Tuesday, any Tuesday. This is Karl-James. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video log. Thank you very much, folks.